we're going to be talking about the most important skill and the most important variable when it comes to roasting coffee. Thanks for joining me today here at the Virtual Coffee Lab. We're going to be taking a roast over a period of time, and we're going to be managing the heat during that roast to craft some great coffee. And last week we used a hot air popcorn popper, no control. The only variable, the only control we had was to decide when we wanted to end the roast. We could not control the fan, we could not control the heat, and that is the limitation of using a hot air popcorn popper when you're roasting coffee. And I'm talking about a stock unmodified hot air popcorn popper. So we're going to go to the next step, and that is to use a roaster that has variables. And in this example, we'll use the Sweet Maria's popper. It has a couple of variables. One is the fan speed. There's really two settings. We're going to leave it on high and not change it at all. And then the other is the heat, or the amount of energy we're going to be applying to these beans during the roast. And that's the only variable that we're going to be messing with here in this roast. We're going to be roasting 80 grams of a Central American coffee. It's a Costa Rica Natural. It's the same coffee that I roasted, I believe, at the last video with the hot air popper. It's a really great coffee. Really enjoyed drinking it. It's got some fruity notes, a little bit of a berry wine kind of a note, and some chocolatey notes in there as well. So we'll get started on that. So here is the Sweet Maria's popper. You can see it has a couple of controls, the fan on the left, the energy or the heat application dial on the right, and there's a timer in the middle. We're not going to be really using that timer at all. We're going to be using a browser-based timer called the Coffee Roasting Timer app. You can look that up in Google or online somewhere. Coffee Roasting Timer app. It's free to use. It's browser-based, and this is going to be our timer. It's also going to be our event marker. It will allow us to mark first crack and end the roast, marking that. And also, we'll be able to measure our development time at the end for those that are aware of what development time is. So this is a really cool app to use. It's free. And we'll also be able to measure our moisture loss on the beans as well, which is really important. So we're going to get started with this roast, and we're going to be talking about how important it is to manage heat. We'll be talking about some other elements as well. We're going to be using our senses to be able to manage this roast and determine how to manage the heat as well. So let's get started and we'll talk about that. Okay, so this popper is set up. This is really nice. When you go up from a hot air popcorn popper to something like this, there's some really nice features that are geared specifically for roasting coffee, because this machine was made specifically for roasting coffee. There's a chaff collector that's built in, and it can hold a higher capacity of beans, twice as much as a hot air popcorn popper can hold. So we're putting the cover on here, and in the front of the machine you'll see there is like a little bowl that is contained in the front of the roaster and contained by this shield, this yellow tinted shield that's on there. Okay, on the left you'll see again the fan setting. This is off, low, and high. We're going to leave it on high, and then the timer is set for level 3 right now. You'll notice that I hand wrote those numbers in there. The popper comes with really no indicator at all, and you can draw in your own, whether it's like a clock face or whether you use numbers like this. And so I use the numbers like this. Okay, let's get the roast started. Okay, immediately you'll see that I've started both the timer and I started the roaster. The roaster is counting down. The first thing that's going to happen is the beans, we're going to start turning. And we're going to see some bean movement here. There'll be my secondary camera will show the beans showing in just a minute. And we have the heat set on kind of a medium heat. And why did I use a medium heat? Well, we'll talk about that in a second because we're going to be talking about times, targeting times. So you can see the bean movement, things are working well. There's the chaff collector, and those are my settings on the popper as we begin this roast. We're going to use minimal changes to our heat during this roast. My goal is to have a total roast time of about 10 minutes, a 5-minute dry, and about 3 minutes, a total of 8 minutes to get to first crack. So 5 minutes in dry, 3 more minutes of roasting before first crack starts, and then another 2 minutes of development time. The beans, you can see, are still spinning. They're just starting to lighten up just a tiny bit. We've been roasting for 1.5 minutes. Heat is being applied. So what are we trying to do during the first 5 minutes of our roast? We're trying to have the heat evenly penetrate the bean. That's our first goal. Our second goal is to get the beans to, as they heat, to change color from green to yellow. And when they turn full yellow, that will be the end of this first phase. That's going to take about 5 minutes. What is happening and how does this phase impact the roast, the taste of the coffee, and the overall roast? It has minimal impact on the flavor of the coffee, but it has everything to do with setting ourselves up for success for the rest of the roast. Depending on the roaster you use, we're building heat, we're building momentum. We want to have, we don't want to have too much momentum, too much heat, because the roast will move too fast, and then we won't have time for flavor development, and we'll be talking about that shortly. So we want to make sure that we're roasting at a good pace, but not too fast. If we roast too slow, then we'll end up having boring, flat coffee, and we won't be able to achieve the flavor development that we want. So we're using, in this example, a 5-minute dry phase, or a dry period of time. You can see, looking at the beans, that we've got some paling going on now. The heat is penetrating the beans. The moisture is starting to evaporate from the beans. There's about a 10 to 12% moisture level in the beans before we roast them, and our goal is to drive out that moisture at an even rate so that we don't have coffee that's roasted on the outside but not fully roasted on the inside. That's the purpose of this first phase. 3 minutes and 30 seconds, I want to get this roaster warmed up a little more, so I've increased my temperature. You can see I went from 3 on the dial to 3.5. I noticed that, looking at the bean color, that I needed to have the beans start yellowing sooner, and I didn't have enough heat applied. So I've notched up the heat a little bit because my goal is to finish the dry phase by 5 minutes. We got a minute left, and so now I've bumped the heat up to level 4 on my roaster, and that is going to help move this roast a little quicker, and that's going to be, hopefully, bring me to my target time exactly as I want. You'll see some chaff coming off on the roaster. I'm smelling hay. I'm smelling kind of a little bit of a yeasty smell, maybe a little bit of kind of a, well, we're past the grassy phase now, and it's starting to be more like a hay. So you were using our senses for smell. Sight is telling us that the coffee is yellowing, and we've got about 20 more seconds or so, and the coffee should be at the dry stage. Right now we're really close, and so I'm going to be calling this dry in about 10 or 12 seconds. All right, so now the next thing we're going to do is we continue to use our senses. We're using sight. I just looked and called dry right there. Got my temperature set at 4. I'm going to leave it there for right now as we're moving towards the next event, which is first crack. That is the event that I'm targeting for a total of 8 minutes. And right now we're at 5 minutes and 20 seconds. So I'm going to need to watch the color of my beans, and I'm going to need to smell and listen and smell and watch what's happening to my roast. I'm starting to smell a little bit of sweetness in the coffee. The coffee is definitely starting to brown. That's what happens in this next phase. We call it the browning phase. Some call it the Maillard phase or the pre-crack phase. There's different ways or different names that we call this phase. But basically during this time, the moisture is still being driven out of the bean. The coffee is starting to brown. Imagine sauteing vegetables and you're caramelizing them. You're trying to take the raw vegetable and you're trying to saute it, and you'll see it turn kind of a golden brown and then a darker brown, and then there's that sweetness that's developed. That's what's happening to the beans here in the coffee roaster right now. All right, so now we are definitely smelling baked goods, some sweetness. We're getting closer to kind of a cinnamon looking color in the beans. We're getting more bean movement, and we've got a minute and a half left before first crack. We're at a 4 right now, and I want to manage. I may increase or decrease my heat so I can make sure first crack happens right around 8 minutes. How do I know when first crack is going to happen? I'm looking at bean color, I'm smelling, I'm listening, I'm looking at how light the beans get as they start to loft, to bounce more inside the roaster. I'm looking at all of that. And there you go. It's looking beautiful. We got an fairly even roast going on right now. And I'm starting to smell a little bit of fruit in my roast. And so this is really a good thing. I'm really happy with the way that this is progressing. First crack is going to happen in about 45 seconds. And so I think I'm going to need to give it a little more power. So I take a look inside, and I'm making an adjustment now because I want to make sure that I get my first crack time. And that should happen close to 8 minutes or so. And we're going to start listening for first crack. We may hear a single crack here, a single crack there, maybe even a 1, 2, but I want to make sure that we've got a real succession of cracks starting, and then we will call first crack. All right, and there's some cracking, and there we go. First crack has started, and I've marked first crack on the timer. So take a look at the timer, and you'll see now that a couple of things have happened. I've marked first crack, and a little blue bar appears, and it's the development bar. That bar is showing a percentage, and it's really interesting because one of the things that we want to do is we want to have a percentage of our total roast be in development. So if we have a 10-minute roast and 2 minutes of that is going to be this last development phase, which we just started, then that's going to be 20% of the total roast time. So what you're seeing on this timer is that reflects the development percentage based on the total roast time so far. So 9 minutes of this roast, and we are at, what does that say? 11%. And I'm going to drop this close to 20%. Look at the beans. Nice, beautiful browning beans. Everything is going really well. I have I've maintained my heat. Actually, I think I lowered my heat just a little bit because I don't want crack to move too fast. And this is something important. I bumped it back down from 4.5 to 4 because first crack started moving fairly quickly, and I wanted to slow that down. What is the impact of that? Why did I slow my heat down? And I just did it again. Now I'm down below 4. I did that because I don't want my temperature to continually rise quickly. I don't want my temperature to rise and cause my beans to get darker and darker. I'm interested in development, but I'm not interested in a really dark roast bean. I want a nice medium roast. So I've backed my heat down just a little bit, and then that is going to help me control and not over roast my coffee. All right, so we finished the roast. I've ended the roast right now, and the roaster was put in the cool mode for a few seconds as I took the lid off, and now I'm dumping out the coffee. So that happened quickly, And that's what happens with roasting coffee. It seems like a blur, and it can happen really quickly. That's why it's important for us to plan. Take a look at that coffee. It is beautiful. The popper did a really nice job. You'll see that there are a couple of beans that are really light looking, and those are known as Quakers. Those are seeds that weren't fully developed properly when they were growing. And so we've got a full roast here, and we're going to measure this out, and we're going to see how much it weighs. And it weighs 68 grams. Now we take a look at the timer, and I punch in 68. I put in 68.5 grams, but it's 68 grams, and we've got a little over 14% of our total or our weight loss for this coffee. And what does that tell me? The 14% tells me that it's a nice solid medium roast. When you're 13, 14, 15%, you're definitely in the solid medium roast range. When you start to get below that, you're in the lighter roast, and when you start to get past that moisture loss, then you're in the darker mode, the darker roast. Okay, so I roasted this coffee a few days ago. I've tasted the coffee. It's rested a few days, and it tastes pretty good. It's not the best that I've done with this Costa Rican coffee. I can roast it better on my drum roaster, but the popper did a good job. This is definitely good coffee that I wouldn't mind drinking every day. It's a lot better than a hot air popcorn popper, and it's a lot better than store-bought coffee. So the coffee tastes good. Definitely had some fruitiness, some berry notes, a little bit of a wine note, and there was that underlying chocolate, but it wasn't as clear and it wasn't as clean as I could get on my drum roaster. So the flavors were just a little muted together, a little more clarity on my drum roaster, but all in all, very happy with the way that the popper roasted this coffee. What we did in this roast, and this is one of the most important takeaways that we can talk about here, is we managed our heat. We made adjustments in our heat so that we directed our roast along its path to land at certain, to make certain event marks. So we met dry end when coffee turned yellow at 5 minutes. We made first crack, it was 5:04 I think. We made first crack around 8:02 or 8:04 or something like that. And then we had our total roast a little longer than 10 minutes. It was 10 minutes and 14 seconds. Those are skills that you should be practicing. Those are skills that you should be aiming towards so that you can craft great coffee. And that's really what this is all about. And so today we used heat to that variable by itself to manage our roast. We did not alter the air. We did not do anything else but manage the heat with this roast. I've got a really helpful video called Roasting with Sight and Smell. It deals with learning to use our senses to roast coffee. It's really important for us to be able to know where we're at in our roast progression. We can know where we're at mostly by smell and by sight. Also, temperature and color is really important, and I have a video called Color is King, and that video is up here in the corner you should check out, and that's really helpful as well, because ultimately when we're using a roaster that, even with a roaster that can measure the bean temperature, many roasters for home roasters, they don't have a bean temperature reading. We use color as an indicator of our roast temperature and how far we want to take our coffee. How dark do we want to take our coffee? And you're going to learn that color is really important, that it will help you know when you need to get that coffee out of the roaster. It'll tell you if you've been moving this coffee too fast and need to slow it down. You need to pay attention to your senses as you're roasting coffee, and that is focusing on sight and smell and even sound, listening to the beans. Depending upon your roaster, you can hear the coffee behave differently in the roaster. It may loft more, it may roll and bounce more as it loses more water weight. So check those videos out. Okay, so I'm interested in learning what stage of roasting you're at. If you are a beginner, have you mastered managing your heat in your roast? I think one of the biggest challenges I have, and I still have it, I've done a good job at learning and growing and gaining control of my roaster, but occasionally I have roasts that I miss my target events, and I have to go back and I have to ask myself why, what happened. And a lot of times it's because either I wasn't paying attention or I changed a variable in my roast that caused things to behave differently. So it could be I'm using different beans, have different moisture level, it could have a different density. So it's best that we start out and we try to use the same coffee at least for the first multiple roasts so that we can understand how our roaster is behaving. And once we do that, then we can start roasting different coffees and we can start tweaking our roasts. One other thing about the profile that I'm using this as a starting point. This is not the only way to roast coffee. It's not the right way to roast coffee. It is a method. This is a method that I use and I've had great success with and I promote here on this channel. It's a starting point. Air roasters can roast some great coffee having a shorter total roast time. So instead of a 10-minute roast, you can roast some great coffee with a 7-minute roast. But I'm using this 10-minute roast because it's easy to demonstrate. It gives us time to talk about it, and it still gives a good result in the coffee. So for now, if you have questions about my roast, if you have questions about things that I've said here in this video, ask them in the comments. That's a great place to start. If you've watched any of my other videos, the comment area is a really important place to look and read because people ask questions or people are offering suggestions, and there's a lot of really good, helpful information. I have learned a lot from it, and you can learn a lot from it as well. So I encourage you to check out the comments. I encourage you to leave some comments. If this video has been helpful for you, please hit the thumbs up right now. That will tell other home coffee roasters that this is a video they should check out. That will tell YouTube to promote this video to home coffee roasters. Also, subscribe to my channel. That really helps me directly, helps this channel grow, and I really appreciate you guys being here. We'll see you next time here at the Virtual Coffee Lab. I hope you have a great week roasting. We'll see you next time.